Hi, we're delighted to have you here, Mr. López Aguilar. Thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure to be with you. I only hope that I can be of use. And good evening, everybody. I'm Juan López Aguilar, member of the European Parliament, chair of the Committee of Liberty, Justice and Home Affairs. I'm a Spanish socialist, and I'm talking to you from Brussels, from my office in Brussels, in a cold winter afternoon in Brussels, snowy Brussels.
That is awesome. Thank you so much. And I know you are also a former Minister of Justice for Spain and a chair professor of constitutional law, just to complete a very long resume there. So we really thank you for your time, and we're very happy at the European Student Think Tank to have you. The topic of this interview was mainly about the new political trends in Europe that have been labeled as populist, but I think maybe a more accurate definition is those that have caused problems from the rule of law perspective and how that influences European politics. So my first question is, in terms of countries like Poland or Hungary, how is that affecting now European politics? Have you seen a change in recent years?
Of course, many changes have been brought about by a series of episodes of crisis that have been linked in a very short period of time, at least for the last 10 years. Great recession, sovereign debt crisis, the refugee crisis, Brexit, illiberal regimes on the rise, and finally, eventually, there came the pandemic with its huge impact. It's been a catastrophic impact on the economic and social magnitudes of the European Union in all and its member states. But yes, it has had an impact on the political landscape, and for good reason. A word that has been on the rise in the, let's say, political lexicology has been the word populism. There has been some confusion about what populism is about, but by now there are so many writings and publishings and explanations and experts and think tanks contributing to clear out what populism is about, that we can come up with some clear-cut ideas about which are the common denominators of what you might call populism across the European Union. For one thing, it's not an ideology, it's a rhetoric. Second, that rhetoric lies on the assumption that you may tell the difference between us, the people, and them, depicted as the enemies of the people. So there is a link between this assumption and the following one, which is simplifying the complexity of pluralism within open societies. And European Union is an open social fabric, that's for sure. And the social fabrics of the member states are also pluralistic and conflictual in many ways. So it's oversimplifying that complexity to pretend that you can tell a clear difference between some us being the people and some others being the enemies of the people. Fourth, it doesn't matter who is depicted as the enemy. It may be the foreigners, it may be the Muslims, it may be those who are depicted as different or inferior. It may be the LGBTI, or it may be the politicians. It doesn't matter. The real point is that that rhetoric is meant to instigate hatred rather than building up solutions. Hatred against those who are depicted as others. You may hate the foreigners, you may hate the Muslims, or you may hate the politicians. But it's about hate. It's about hating someone, which in the end means that they are meant to enhance and widen the cleavages of a pluralistic society instead of building up common solutions and consensual grounds to tackle challenges. And the European Union is about building up consensual grounds out of complexity and diversity, precisely to face together issues that otherwise would escape our capacity. I think a very good example is precisely the pandemic. Is it a local issue? Is it a national issue? Or is it a global issue? would have been better for the member states to negotiate with the giants of the pharmaceutical industry, to do it on their own, one by one, trusting their own capacities, instead of negotiating together and trying to come to terms with the big pharmaceutical industry as to the vaccine strategy and the distribution and the calendar of the administration and who is first and who is later to be vaccinated, so that we can prevent the virus to crumble down the process of the European Union in all. And is it possible for the member states to pay some solidarity when going global as to approaching the strategy against the pandemic, rather than make it together under the European umbrella? So the answer is clear. We need to build up the European Union, and populism is anti-European. That is for sure.
But precisely, you were talking about the pandemic, and indeed, these populist movements have conditioned a bit the funds that have been used for the recovery. Like, I'm talking about the Next Generation EU, and particular that fight against the Commission, between the Commission and Poland and Hungary in particular, with regards to that rule of law clause. So do you think that how much was that in terms of damage to the European Union integration process and the use of the recovery funds? Do you think it was a lost opportunity there to control the rule of law, or are you happy about the compromise reached with these countries?
You're making a very relevant point, because you bring in light to one very good example of how populism is absolutely counterproductive to the European process. It's in contradiction with the European process and with the very European ideal. Populism has a link with reactionary nationalism, that's for sure, because populism is precisely about exploiting the anguish and fear of going global and being globally relevant, which is precisely the destiny of the European Union as a process, as a political process, trying to be globally relevant in a world that is globalized for good, in a world that happens to be global for good more than ever before. That is precisely the point. And of course, there is populism in those reactionary regressions, anti-democratic and anti-European at the same time, which have been calling themselves illiberal regimes as an alternative to liberal, pluralistic, open societies, which is what the values which are enshrined in Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union are about. When we enshrine values as equal dignity for all, liberties, fundamental rights protected by a judiciary which is independent and whose independence is guaranteed on the premises of rule of law, representative democracy, protection of minorities, which include the right of opposition to oppose those who are in government, and protection of political pluralism. When you oppose those values, claiming that you have an illiberal alternative, you're simply going anti-European, if not directly Europhobe. And in my view, I have been the chair of the Libe Committee of Justice and Home Affairs, which is responsible for the rule of law, democracy, and fundamental rights for some time. In my assessment, that is the case of Poland and Hungary first, ever since they have been ruled by an absolute majority leaning on reactionary nationalism intertwined with populistic rhetorics, with populist rhetorics, for sure. We have been concerned about the drive of Hungary first under Fidesz ruling majority and its prime minister becoming increasingly autocrat in Hungary, and Poland under Law and Justice ruling majority going increasingly against Europe in every possible way. They have been embarked in a series of judicial reforms, restricting liberties, including media freedom and media pluralism, government-controlled institutions which are meant to control governments, so that the overall constitutional architecture of those two countries in the European Union have been overturned actually under a breakdown, under a virtual breakdown for the last 5 years. In a very abrupt period of time, they have overturned the institutional and constitutional architecture beyond recognition. That is why we talk about a constitutional breakdown in those countries. And of course, we have seen that a very eloquent example of that reactionary trend has been precisely denying the effort that has been endorsed by the majority of the European Parliament to come up with a European response against the economic and social impact of the pandemic by launching an ambitious multi-annual financial framework more than ever before on the rise, accompanied with a so-called next generation EU, which is called in many countries the so-called recovery fund, precisely to support the efforts that are to be made by the member states to get the economy and the social needs back on track and to meet the needs of those who have been most severely damaged by the impact of the economic crisis, and putting everything on hold in a tug of war with the European institutions, trying to blackmail actually the European institutions on their denial to accept the principle of rule of law conditionality, which has been regulated by the European Parliament precisely to make sure that access to European funds and budgetings is conditioned, actually conditioned, to full compliance with the founding values of the European Union, which are enshrined in Article 2 and are therefore binding law for all of the member states, including Hungary and Poland, namely rule of law, democracy, fundamental rights, pluralism, and protecting minorities. If they are in denial of those principles, then there is a major crisis in the European Union going on.
That is a very interesting analysis of Article 2 values. And precisely, you mentioned a way that Europe is trying to enforce those values, but I am a bit concerned if there is really a strong enforcement mechanism of those values, because when a member state or state wants to become a member of the EU, we do go through an analysis of those values. But what happens at this point? We never thought that there would be a comeback in terms of rule of law, I guess. What do you propose? And here I ask you both as a member of parliament and a legal scholar, in terms of giving a solution to make sure those values are protected.
That is why we have been talking about an existential challenge to the European Union, for the reason of being of the European Union, an existential challenge that has been posed by the so-called illiberal regimes that have taken hold on nothing less than 2 member states of the European Union of recent accession, because they were into the European Union, into the pack of the so-called great enlargement that took place in 2004. Hungary and Poland have been there not for long. So it's actually shocking that they are posing such an existential challenge to the European Union. But precisely for that, it is a matter of concern to realize that the whole architecture of the European Union, the overall architecture, was meant to count on the willingness of the member states and the institutions of the member states to comply with European law and to actually enforce European law. The European Union does not have a law enforcement complete architecture. It largely counts on the member states, judiciaries, and public prosecutors to enforce European law. And of course, it's based on the principle that there is a judicial body by the name of European Court of Justice, whose rulings are ascertaining on a regular basis the uniform and binding interpretation of the European law on the principles of direct effect and primacy. So they are to supersede national law when needed. Those are the principles on which the whole building is being conceived, and the whole building is grounded on its pillars. But when you see that there are countries which are in defiance of European law, do not care about the accumulation of infringement procedures, being launched by the Commission on the grounds of breaching European law. And more than that, they do not care about the rulings of the judicial body of the rulings of the European Court of Justice, then you have an existential challenge. That is why we have done our best to come up with new ideas. For one thing, we have established the so-called rule of law framework, which means that on a regular basis, following the parameter that has been set by the Justice Scoreboard, or even in the European semester in the financial and budgeting field, all of the member states are to be examined on a regular basis, on a general basis, all of them, and on objective parameters, some parameters which have been said to be objective every year. And the Commission has come up for the first time in September with the first so-called rule of law report, which encompasses an overarching analysis of all of the 27 member states with the same parameters, so that you can foresee when there is a risk of deviating from the principles of the treaty. We have also regulated the so-called rule of law conditionality, so that there is an economic sanction to those countries which are in not compliance or in defiance of European law. But more than that, we have done our best to set in motion the legal device which is at disposal by now, which, as everybody knows by now, is the link between Article 2 and Article 7 of the Treaty of the European Union. What Article 7 is about? It's about that the European Parliament, by 2/3 majority, I have been the rapporteur on those files as chair of the Libe Committee. On the majority of 2/3, the the Parliament launched the procedure foreseen in Article 7 to sanction those countries which are in serious breach, in a clear risk of serious breach of European law. Ultimately, the sanction would be depriving those countries from the voting rights in the Council. But it would take unanimity of the Council for that, exception being made of the countries concerned, of course. All of the rest should agree that there is a clear risk of serious breach of European law. And we have embarked the Council, and we keep putting pressure. We have been keeping up the pressure, and the Council should feel the heat of the European Parliament, making the real strong point that some action is needed, so that those who have engaged in a blackmail against the European interest of the rest of the countries to come up with a common response against the pandemic and foresee a better future are not going to get away with it.
I am really hopeful about that action, and also happy to see how broad consensus there is on the Parliament on this issue. So I hope they will go forward. And as for now, I was specifically interested in the rights of minorities, because it's true that we're talking of Hungary and Poland, but of course they bring wonderful cultures, and there is also a lot of people in Hungary and Poland that are also the victims of these new trends, these new political trends. So how does the EU help them? For example, the queer community or some other minorities in those countries?
Well, first of all, ever since the Lisbon Treaty entered into force, along with the Charter of Fundamental Rights, the European Parliament is stronger than never before. That means that now the European Parliament deals with fundamental rights of the European citizens, including equality rights, non-discrimination, Article 20 and 21 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, non-discrimination of grounds of whatever kind, not only on the grounds of race, sex, religion, or ideology, but also on the grounds of being able or person with some sort of handicap or capacity problem, or sexual orientation, for that matter, or gender identity. And we do care of those principles throughout a number of policy-making lines, including our regular scrutiny on the agencies which have been set forth precisely to serve that purpose. namely the Fundamental Rights Agency, which provides reports as to the state of the play of discrimination or violations of rights of the European citizens across the member states of the European Union, particularly when it comes to certain categories of people. When it comes to ethnic and cultural discrimination, then there comes the Roma people. But it's also anti-Semitism on the rise, linked with populism and extremism, radical extremism, particularly extreme right-wing extremism. There is also, of course, LGBTI discrimination. And again, that is a serious issue in Poland, where LGBTI people are systematically discriminated. Actually, the rhetoric of the ruling party goes that they have every right on the grounds of the alleged national Polish identity to declare themselves free from LGBTI people. And we have heard in the European Parliament unacceptable speeches which are offensive in every way, on the assumption that LGBTI would be an ideology which is being transported from the rest of the European Union into a nation, Poland, which allegedly would be immune to LGBTI ideology, declaring themselves LGBTI-free zones. That's completely unacceptable, completely anti-European. It's against European law in every possible way. It's not understanding at all what the European Union is about. So we do care, and we keep reporting regularly about all forms of discrimination and trying to tackle, to crack down on every form of discrimination, try to remove them and engage the Commission in actual action, launching infringement procedures and raising awareness and supporting NGOs and organizations and think tanks which are devoted to the training and capacity building and education on the knowledge and the joy of fundamental rights across the European Union. Namely, we have established in the LIBE Committee a number of programs within the European Union budget which are relevant for the purpose of fighting against all forms of discrimination, particularly the justice and values programs, values against all forms of discrimination, particularly gender discrimination, and raising Daphne is a program which is a paragraph within the justice and value program, is precisely about gender identity discrimination. And in all, the endowment, the allocation of that justice and values program has been on the rise because of the efforts of the European Parliament. And now it sums up in all by some 1.6 billion euros, which is something for the next multi-annual financial framework. So I think we are taking good care about the education and culture and civic rights, including the principle of fight against all forms of discrimination across the European Union.
I think all that work is very welcome. Thank you. So to end this interview, we are at the European Student Think Tank. We're a youth organization. We believe in how young generations can help Europe. So I wonder if you had any advice on a specific action that young people should take to promote European values and build understanding with other states.
But of course, the European Union is regularly trying to reach out to the younger generation. In my understanding, that is the very core raison d'être, reason for being of the European process. I usually state that the European Union is about solidarity and cohesion, territorial between European regions and member states, social between status of well-being, those who are privileged and those who are underprivileged, but also generational, between an aging society, which is by large the trend in the European Union, and the younger generations, which deserve the same level of welfare and hope that have been secured from the older generations. So I think in every possible way, the European Union has to do better as to reaching out to the younger generation. Of course, Erasmus is an example of it, renowned, very much highlighted as a very good example, and actually as a story of success, as trying to reach out to the younger generation in order to spread the message that going European is actually worthy, linking feelings, love, spirits, but also dreams and hopes, which are cross-border in its nature and scope. But more than that, we regularly have interlocution with youth organizations within the remits of the European Parliament. I know it's getting tougher because of the pandemic, which is lasting all too long. The pandemic has somehow put to a halt most of the dynamics in which we were engaged. But one thing is for sure, President von der Leyen has been invested as president precisely on the grounds of her commitment to launch, among other relevant goals for her mandate and the commission, the current commission's mandate, 2019-2024, to launch a so-called Conference on the Future of Europe. And this Conference on the Future of Europe is meant precisely to reach out to NGOs, civil society, all of the relevant organizations, the constellation of organizations that are to be heard of when thinking and speaking out loud what kind of Europe we want to endow and somehow to transfer to future generations, which are to inherit a better architecture, a better lawmaking, a better citizenship status, and more solid realizations of the principles which are often invoked as distinctive of the European Union. We are a heavyweight when it comes to humanitarian aid, commitment, cooperation, human rights in our diplomacy as an inspiration for the External Action Service, rule of law as relevant not only when we talk to other global actors, but when we talk about ourselves, the way we see ourselves too, the values we demand from ourselves to keep our own stature, but also as to an opportunity to engage in very constructive talks as to design together, interactively, a better future for Europe. I think the process is meant precisely to engage the younger generations in universities and elsewhere through the network of youth organizations. So I think that is certainly a must. And believe me, if I may say, it links with my personal, ideological, and political commitment. I belong to a political family which is deeply concerned.
I'm sorry, Mr. López Aguilar, but we lost you a bit. You were saying you belong to a political family, and after that we lost you a bit. Sorry.
Yeah, I belong to a political family. Can you see me now? Can you read me now?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. I belong to a political family who deeply concerned about the increasing gap that the European dynamics have described to the younger generations to be actually incorporated and to have a sense of belonging to the European process. The gap between the level of of welfare standards of those who are aging, as opposed to the way in which the younger family I belong to. So we have made our best to get the social pillar back on track, to get inclusiveness back on track, to get the sense of belonging and European citizenship back on track. It was not only about this so-called European semester and keeping the budgets in line. It is precisely about getting the younger generations or the union will have another 50 years of development and hopefully of success.
Thank you very much. We, from the younger generation, will also be looking forward to that conference for the future of Europe and the projects are coming with it. Thank you for being here. It's been a wonderful interview. So our thanks from everybody at the European Student Think Tank from your time.
Let me simply say hello to all of you viewers and thank you for your attention. And I only hope that it was of some use to have this talk. And I keep confident that sooner than later, we will better be back on personal talks, personal gatherings, opportunity to shake hands, to meet with each other. People, real people, can get to visit again the European Parliament with no restrictions, as it has been the case painfully for some time now, for a year now, and we can actually be sure that we are representing European citizens which are motivated and committed to European values and the European process and the European decision making, as it is your organization and the people you represent. So it's been my pleasure to talk to you, and I hope to see you personally soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We really miss it. Thank you.